Thank you very much, Marie, and many thanks to Mark Spiegler, to Marie Spirito, to Annelie Graf, the amazing team here at our Basel, also Stefan and Elena. I'd also like to say special thank yous to Bettina Korek, as well as to Amit Sood and Freya Murray, and also Laurent Gavo, as well as to Ben Vickers. Conversations with them have been very instrumental in, thinking about this topic of digital archives, which we're going to address today. And of course, all my thanks go to Sabih, Ahmed, and Glenn Phillips for joining us here today. And please give another very warm welcome to Sabih and to Glenn. Sabih is senior researcher at the Asia Art Archive. One of his main focuses has been to lead on digitization project of Artist Archive, very much what we want to discuss here today. And that, of course, leads us to Glenn Phillips, who is the curator and head of modern and contemporary collections at the Getty, and has there, of course, pioneered many archive projects, but also done many exhibitions, such as the 2008 exhibition California Video, or 2007 Evidence of Movement, which are very relevant in relation to the topic of the archive here. We want to investigate the major shift of archives from analog to digital by museums, historian, and artists, and of course also the acceleration of technology and what it means. I'm personally very preoccupied with this topic because I record every day digitally for many years now, conversations and interviews with artists, document exhibitions, so far more than 3,000 hours, and I live in a constant, what Jonas Mekas always calls, kind of digital paranoia of losing things, doing multiple backups, multiple clouds, all the things we can do, because Jonas Mekas always told me the best way is to have many parallel realities. So I hope to learn today, and I think we all can hope to learn today from the two experts, how to maybe have less digital paranoia. Interesting also seems to me the topic of what archives can do between themselves. I always think that an archive on its own can be a bit lonely. We once did a book with the University in Lüneburg, which we called actually Inter-Archive, where we explored this whole space of what can happen when different archives, create alliances. So I'm going to be particularly interested to hear what the two of you think of such alliances and how you collaborate with other archives. But maybe to begin with the beginning, I wanted to ask you both to tell us a little bit about your two pioneering projects with archiving as a case study, and then we can sort of, take it from there. So maybe we can start with you.
Sure. Thank you. And hello. Am I audible? Hello? Hello? Okay, great. Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Hans Ulrich, for such a generous introduction. Thank you all for being here. My name's Sabih, and I work with the Asia Art Archive. And what we do at the archive is largely to build artists' archives. Now, it sounds pretty simple because artists have always been archiving in their own different formats what they do, their practice and things. And a lot of the residue of what finally gets left behind of the artwork is the kind of stuff we more or less look at. But the way we develop projects is not just by going around hoovering everything up. The idea is really to understand the different imaginations of the archives of the past and how they inhabit today. And those imaginations of the archives, my contention is that artists, in a sense, the kind of archives that they produced are precursors to today's explosion of the archive. Because so far, archives used to be about containment, classification, order. Artists would go crazy with it. And so when they would go crazy with it, that is the kind of time we're living in right now. So when we revisit those archives of the past, what kind of clusters, what kind of accumulations of information, data, these kind of things really reside in. And so we develop projects which are both to test the limits and the imaginations of the archive, and of course make useful collections that can be accessible online for research and all kinds of purposes. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much.
And I'm Glenn Phillips. I work at the Getty Research Institute, and one of our primary mandates at the Research Institute, we have a very large library collection, but we also collect archival materials. And in the 20th and 21st century, that can mean artist papers or the papers of curators, collectors, gallerists, other kinds of institutions. And so, for the longest time, most of our work has really been analog archives. But then we're getting more and more brought into the digital because everyone whose collection we bring in has made that transition themselves. And so it's been interesting for me to see how researchers react to that shift, because often people, they want to look at every piece of paper, but when it comes to actually poking around on someone's hard drive, which they can do, they feel awkward. And they feel like they're invading privacy, whereas they have no problem reading someone's diaries and all of those confessionals. So, but I think that might have a little bit to do with how close it is to our everyday reality, because we're often putting our private thoughts in our emails or on our computer somewhere. And in terms of projects, what that has meant is the people who actually make analog preservation of their materials are getting researched a little more. One of the archives that I'm working on right now is the archive of the curator Harald Zeeman. And Zeeman, while he had email, he never actually wrote an email himself. His career was sort of begun with the fax machine. And when Zeeman would travel, he always carried 2 shopping bags full of paper. And that paper were the things he needed to respond to. So, he would have all the emails printed out, and he would handwrite his response on it. And then he would fax stacks of paper back to his office, and then his office would either write the email response or they would type the fax response and then send it to the appropriate place. And so in a strange way, Zeeman's hard drive is spread across this massive analog archive that's a linear kilometer of material. And we've had researchers coming from all over the world to look at this material, but then there's only one person I know of who's ever looked at his hard drive, and that's my research assistant. So it's interesting to see how scholars are starting to come to terms with some of this material.
It's interesting because that, of course, leads us also then from the analog to the digital, and the question of, is there such a thing as a digital dark age? It's in early 2015 that Vince Cerf, who is one of the pioneers of the internet and also one of the vice presidents of Google, caught the attention of all mainstream media by actually proclaiming a warning of an impending digital dark age. And a couple of years ago, we did a talk with Daniel Hillis, another great pioneer of the digital age, with Bettina Corrigan for Your Art in LA. And Daniel Hillis also talked about this digital dark age. So I was kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit about this, but not only about these concerns, but maybe also things which already have been lost. Because I think it's interesting that we not only project in this, this possibility of things being lost, but that there actually is a reality of things already having been lost.
Sure. Well, I think for artists and curators working today, you probably know that so much of your work now gets done over text rather than by email, certainly not by a letter. And I even have a lot of artists who send me business correspondence on social media. And I know I don't have any of my texts from the 90s. I have no record of how, those kind of early, sort of really early generation of cell phones communication, that's sort of all gone. I don't have my first couple of email addresses. I maybe printed out a couple things here and there, but I think a lot of times things we take for granted are gone, and so a lot of the process of how exhibitions are actually made today, may or may not be getting preserved. And in terms of another thing that I lament the passing of, I guess, is in photography, the analog contact sheet. When photographers were working with rolls of film and making careful choices about when they're shooting, and then making choices that you can see about what to develop or how to crop and how to change, then that's a moment where you can see someone thinking. You can see the thought process of the photographer, of how they arrive at what they're going to develop. And that's sort of now gone, when so often with digital photography, maybe some people may keep and save every single shot they take, but I think a lot delete the ones that they don't want to use. And what I found so often is I love contact sheets because It captures the things the photographer didn't know was important at the time, didn't think was relevant, and now decades later it's very, very relevant. For instance, in one project where we're trying to reconstruct what an exhibition was, we look through hundreds of images and then find out that an important Ed Kienholz piece, someone's head was in front of in every single image except for one. And that one was not a shot of that piece. The photographer was taking a shot of something else, but it happened to be on the contact sheet. So we never know what information we're preserving, even when we think we're trying to capture something else.
I'll answer in three kind of anecdotes. The first, of course, as a prelude to Vint Cerf's paranoia about the digital dark age, it's primarily based on the idea that what if all the formats that we use today, such as PDF, JPEG, TIFF, WAV files, they all become obsolete 10, 20 years from now? What's going to happen to all this flood of data that we're producing today? Is it all going to be lost? And the three anecdotes that I have are, number one, there's too many countries in the world and too many regions in the world where the only means to preserve stuff at the moment is through digitization, and you have whatever available means you have to preserve those things. So, and Vint Cerf is the vice president of Google. I think there's a vested interest there in him wanting to promote cloud technology, that the best way to preserve things is by putting them on cloud and by certain kind of softwares that certain industries will be making at the end of the day. So in certain countries, I think the whole idea of digitization is almost pivotal in preserving a lot of things happening. The second anecdote is from a story by Borges about how, I don't know if any of you have read this, about this villager who was a librarian. And what he would do is that because he didn't have the means to acquire the books and not enough funds, so he would read these interesting reviews of books, and based on the titles and the reviews, he would write his books, write those same books, and his entire library was flourishing with books that he himself has created. So if there is a complete loss of data, I think humanity is going to be always imaginative and inventive with the kind of stories and with the kind of meaning-making processes that we want to inhabit.
One of the things which I think is also interesting in terms of the digitization of archive is, of course, the immense amount of material there is. And I was kind of wondering, in terms of your two archives, where the decision is made and how the decision is made, what to digitize and what not to digitize. Which archives you buy, which archives you don't buy. And I think it's also interesting, because how you go about acquiring archives, because it's not something, which is, I think, as easy as buying an artwork, which is, basically on the art market. I think archives, it's usually a much longer story. It's probably because it's somebody's live work. So I suppose very often it's a longer, dialogue. So I'm just very curious because I think very little is known about, how actually this actual process functions.
I mean, at AA, we're not-for-profit, so we're also always struggling with funding as to how to sustain the preservation of all the documents that we acquire. What we largely do is digitize them. We don't have the wherewithal, or we don't even try to preserve the analog and the hard copies. And the reason being, it's better off that they stay with those owners, or the people who are custodians of those documents, so that they can decide what they want to do with it. When it comes to our criteria for digitization, acquiring archives, is largely led by research questions. So we rarely ever go to a collection and say, okay, we should have this, as opposed to if we're looking at, say, the 60s and 70s, as a generation or as an era which art historians think is too recent and curators think it's too far gone. Those are the kind of histories that have not often been paid enough attention, 60s, 70s, 80s. So we're looking at artists, we're looking at collections, which were of that generation. New countries, new republics are coming into presence. New institutions are beginning their museums and their libraries and archives. So their own collections are not often preserved or accessed. And we kind of focus in on various questions and various collections, which would be relevant today. That's our criteria largely.
And at the Getty, well, we take almost an opposite approach because we are trying to physically collect the archive and preserve the materials. So when we acquire a collection, it physically comes to us in Los Angeles, and we catalog and preserve it there. That also means that we have to be very selective because there's only so much space and only so much staff to be doing that. And we need to be even more selective in deciding what that comes through the door gets digitized, because we can't digitize everything. And those decisions matter, because when something becomes digitally available online, then it's accessible to a much larger number of people in a slightly different way, but the information is at least transmitted in some form. I will say, I wish we could simply choose what to digitize, but the fact is often copyright law is going to affect that decision quite a bit. So even if we have an artist's collection, let's say the Alan Capro archive, for instance, we might have permission from Capro or his estate to digitize things, but that doesn't mean that we have permission from the photographers who photographed Capro's performances. It doesn't mean we have permission from the other artists or other scholars who wrote to him. We may not have permission to publish those words. So, if you have a case where all of a sudden an archive is going to be full of holes when you put it online, then you've changed people's perception of what it's going to be. And so we tend to, partly what guides our decision is how complete we can be in digitizing.
One thing which I thought is also super interesting is this idea that it's not only the content of an archive, which is to be somehow preserved, if you think about preservation. And it goes actually back again to Vint Cerf and his, statement about potential loss of archives. Because he sort of talked about the idea that certain media are no longer be, readable in the future, or no longer be accessible in the future, so that one actually almost also has to archive, preserve, and collect the hardware to actually play the actual documents. Can you give us some example and tell us how you both address that in your archives?
I think the Getty has amazing stories about this, given the scale of...
Yeah, well, we for us, I think in particular, we're doing this with audio and video media, and so we have audio recordings going back to the 1920s that are on wires, all these strange formats, and when you get into the video era in the late 60s and 70s. There were machines that came and went in less than a year sometimes. They would enter the market, but then no one bought them because they were buying a different brand instead, and so then those machines go off the market. And so whenever we get a tape in some weird new format, then we commit to finding the machine somewhere. And you can't just find one of that machine, you have to find several. Because you also then are responsible for keeping it working. You can't just call up Sony and order, a gear for one of their old video players. That doesn't exist anymore. So you have to get multiple of the machines so you can cannibalize them for parts and try to keep them going. So this corollary archive has to be built alongside for every technology that you're trying to deal with. Also with different types of old digital storage methods, whether it's floppy drives or jazz drives, other kinds of old tape drives and what have you. It's really difficult to keep that stuff operating.
I think it goes without saying that archives are entirely dependent on mediums of remembrance, right? Mediums of memory. And those mediums of memory have continuously been changing over centuries and centuries. In the Greek classical era, Socrates and Plato's and Aristotle's entire debate would be that memory and knowledge should be embodied. It's in fact a contamination of memory if it's written down. Another era in which, when, say, the Gutenberg Revolution was happening, you have parchments being replaced by the printed book. And there would be huge debates and huge crises as to know these printed books are a contamination or they're not true knowledge. It's the parchments as those manuscripts which are for real. And now in the digital era, there's all this paranoia about how the internet is not a reliable source of information. We still have to rely on books. So these are entire regimes by which knowledge circulated across centuries. And I think the paranoia about the digital becoming, or certain formats in the digital becoming obsolete is a bit far-flung, because I think we're in an era where there's increasing demand upon digital content that can be catered for AI. So in fact, we're arbitrarily producing data as we speak in the ways we use our mobile phones, in the ways we send emails. So all of this data is being harnessed, even if they're not human users for it, but the algorithms that are all contributing to a development of these augmented intelligence and artificial intelligence sort of technology. So, I mean, for us at AA, we're largely reliant on digitization of archives. We have not had the problem so far of technologies to read those going obsolete. I think if obsolescence is going to come in the way, it's going to be because certain industries are going to make them non-readable. And so certain companies might want certain things to not be immediately accessible to you, and therefore you have to buy them. So I think those are the kind of impending crises that we might be often thinking about. And I think our belief, because we're not into possessing copyrights at AA, is that there's an idea of thinking about preservation not by holding on to it and grasping it really close, but by disseminating. Preservation by dissemination. So the more multiples you can circulate, you lose your data, someone else probably got it. The internet is kind of like that, of course, in its own arbitrary and sometimes biased ways, but yeah.
But that's interesting. I mean, one of the things I think which becomes clear is, of course, that it's not kind of like only positive or negative. That on the one hand, we gain through digital media, and on the other hand, we lose. And I mean, one thing which is obvious to me is that we lose a lot on the level of, artist correspondence. I mean, I'm at the moment working on a book of all my letters, letter exchange with Maria Lasnik, who was in her 90s when she passed away a few years ago, and we, exchanged hundreds of letters, of course. They were just put in a folder, they're, not lost. The same with Gustav Metzger. I had hundreds of letter exchanges, and, it wouldn't be possible for me to do that with the artists of my generation, with whom I've spoken more, but for the very reason what you've been saying, that earlier emails are lost, that also the correspondence is much, much more fragmented. Maria Lasnik would have these letters on her desk for weeks and always add a little bit until the letter is completed. And then, she'd, after weeks, send me the letter. So it's almost like a piece of literature in a way. So we clearly lose, I think, for future art historians, on the level of artist correspondence. But then at the same time, I think we gain on the level of exhibitions, because I think in terms of exhibition history, it's always really devastating if we look at old exhibitions and realize that there are just 7 slides, and that there is really nothing. I mean, a couple of years ago, we started to do this research with, on les immatériaux with Philippe Pareno and Daniel Birnbaum, because in a way we found out through actually Lyotard, the curator of les immatériaux, having told Philippe Pareno that he wanted to do a show on resistances, an unrealized show. We wanted to realize that, and it's now going to happen with the Luma Foundation as an actual realized project. And then we kind of found out, that there's barely documentation on les immatériaux. There's maybe a box at the Pompidou with a few images, and of course there's a couple of scholars now who made research, so we found that. And I think on that level it's clearly improving, because there's much, much more information on exhibitions. And that leads me to the next question, because I think it's very interesting that idea that an archive actually can not only document an exhibition, but can also become an exhibition. And I wanted to ask you both how with your archives you're going to address that. Will there be an exhibition of the Harald Seemann archive? Will there an exhibition of several of your archives? It would be great to hear about that.
Of course, archives lend themselves to exhibitions, and increasingly exhibitions are using archival documents as a way to support the works that they want to show, especially historical exhibitions and things like that. But at the archive, like I said, because we're always excited about what imaginations of the archive we inhabit, we're often inviting artists to, in fact, produce artworks that engage with our collection, or that engage with the concepts of archives. So that's one way, and we did a project with Shilpa Gupta in 2015, where she saw a collection of Geeta Kapoor and Vivan Sundaram's archive. These are two very important figures in the art scene who've been active since the 60s. Vivan is an activist and an artist. Geeta Kapoor is a critic and a curator. And together, their combined archive, because they're a couple, had all kinds of documents ranging from exhibition photographs to letters to portraits and all sorts of things, diaries. So Shilpa comes to AA and upon our invitation and says, you've got such interesting documents, but what about the love stories? What about the fallouts? Because so much of the art field is based upon one artist having moved to another city because their lover was moving to that city. What about those stories? How do we capture those? And we started rummaging through the collection, and we found very little, unfortunately, because Geeta and Vivan did not share all of that with us. Hopefully they will one day. But so when she accesses this collection, she realizes the way we have to go about it is by creating other stories, a whole different web of stories. And so what kind of connections of documents that are in the archive and that new documents that we have to produce, sometimes of rumor, sometimes of memory. And from those documents, she created this beautiful installation of how we might start seeing interesting tangents and connections. So, in fact, the archive itself, turning from a medium of communication to a medium of being an artwork, is not a new thing. And so I think for AA, we lend ourselves through those. But, to your question, and I won't take too long, but to your question about how things are being lost and so many things in our era are not on physical documents and not preservable. I mean, there are entire traditions, entire regions and places in the world which have not followed the methods or the procedures of archiving. And those cultures are, should we say, being lost? I mean, they're still around. Say folk song culture. So people, scholars, interesting, especially a lot of post-colonial studies, has been looking into redefining the archive. We have to be inventive about the very definition of the archive, the very medium of the archive, and the very processes of it. And so how do we start thinking about folk songs and song cultures or, songs of resistance as being archives in themselves? And how then do you encode or recode those songs to become repositories of memories, collective thinking? And so I think the question comes back to the archive to be inventive with what it does.
I try to think very carefully about what are the areas of artistic activity, artistic practice, wherein archival documentation comes close to or crosses over into the artwork itself. And so that means areas like performance art or institutional critique or other kinds of distributed or temporary practices where the remnants of what is left hold on to a bit of that notion of the artwork. And that's become, and since we are kind of physically preserving things, that's one of the areas where we focus most at the Getty Research Institute. And so in that case, we've had many cases where Yvonne Rayner's retrospective at the Museum Ludwig a few years ago, there were 188 objects in the exhibition, and 186 of them came from her archive at the Getty. And so there are certain types of artists where the only thing that's left of their work is the archive. And it was similar with the Alan Kepro retrospective several years ago. There were re-realizations of his pieces, but much of the sort of physical aspect of the exhibition was coming from the archive. So I think more and more curators, from all across the profession are becoming more comfortable with working with archives because it's simply such a big part of artistic practice now to produce things that mostly only leave an archival trace after they're gone.
Well, that's incredibly important. Do you have more examples?
Was it an example, but also just a thought that I think that not everything should be archived. I mean, not everything is archivable. And the charm of archives and the very definition of archives is that at the end of the day, it's only a fragment. It's not going to be everything. So the fact that it's only part is the beauty or is the function of the archive because there's that much more that is outside of it. If the archive contains everything, then you have a Borges story of a 1:1, 1:1 map of the world. So the map is literally the world. And if the archive does not exclude anything, it's not an archive, it is reality, in a manner of speaking.
Before we open it to all your questions about the archive, I have maybe two last questions. One thing actually goes back to a very sort of old conversation at the beginning of the 90s I had with Felix Gonzalez Torres, and he and I often spoke about archives, and he said that he in a way believes that very often people kind of focus on archives too late, because usually archives are archived posthumously or very late in the life of someone. I mean, either the person has passed away, like Harald Seemann, that happens posthumously, or it's a very, very senior artist, as the examples you gave with Ivan Reiner or Vivan Sundaram and Gita Kapoor, three great pioneers, in the 70s, 80s. So what Felix said is things could actually go another way by starting to think about that earlier. He thought about this idea, for example, that he developed little archives where the artwork was a little archive, and he would then always send things, every couple of weeks, to the person, the museum, who would have that mini archive. And he was talking about this idea that, in a way, it's almost like a live archive. So I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on this idea of Felix, that to basically, that almost like the archive or the archiving accompanies someone practice, so it isn't kind of starting late?
I've encountered many cases where, by the time it occurs to an artist that they should have been saving, or they should be saving things, all the things they should have been saving are gone, and there is very little archive left. And that also, when you think about archival collections, you're seeing the collections of the artists who made archives. Many don't, whether they meant to or not. But also, there's no one way that an archive exists. I mean, they are, an archive has to be defined and shaped, and there are a lot of decisions that can go into that. I mean, speaking of love stories, we discovered that two artists whose archives we have at the Getty had a very hot, torrid, illicit love affair for decades, and one of them took all the letters out, and the other one kept all the letters in, and then we have this strange situation that it means the letters that are preserved are from the person who didn't want them preserved, right? Because they took out the letters from the person who kept them in her archive. So, how personal a collection is going to be is also a decision that maybe the artist would rather make than leaving it to others afterward.
Whether the very process of archiving is built into the work, case by case. I mean, we work with some artists like Vivan himself or Ghulam Mohammad Sheikh who would be engaging with archive building as their artistic projects. So the collection that Vivan Sundar inherited of Amrita Shergill, a pioneering artist of the early 20th century, took the manifestation of artworks, took the manifestation of books that Vivan himself produced. So there are those artists. And of course, we're also developing projects around performance art, where a number of those performance artists, in fact, resist archiving. And so the biggest excitement of that project is not so much to find documents of it, but what kind of new documents do we produce of a history of performance art that took place in, say, the 70s and 80s. So again, being inventive oftentimes comes into play. But of course, we don't want to blur the edges that documents found in the past can easily be replaced by documents we produce or the metadata we produce. We do keep that separation. But if the idea is to revisit past in all kinds of interesting ways, what kind of material or memory landscape do you want to produce using existing stuff and newly made stuff?
Maybe a last question is about the sort of cutting edge kind of current state of technology and what that could mean for archive. The other day I visited George Church, and we talked about DNA, and he explained to me that DNA can keep archives safe for centuries to come, because actually he was telling me that we could put the DNA of many books and many films into tiny little glass capsules, and completely avoid humidity through that. Obviously, humidity being the key danger for any archive, as we know. And that would lead to a completely different possibility of actually, longevity, or, it's a bit like the Daniel Hillis, Stuart Brand, Sharon Lanier, the whole idea, Brian Eno, the Long Now Foundation, when they kind of are interested in this idea of extremely long-term archives, extreme long durations. So these little glass capsules with the DNA, they could of course survive, and they could also, according to George Church, be transported easily to other planets. So it would be a much more advanced version of the golden record of NASA, which was of course a very low-tech version of that idea that we could save archives from Earth on other planets. So that sounded a bit like sci-fi, but according to George Church, and also a recent piece actually in the New York Times, it all seems quite real. And at the same time, of course, there is also sort of whole idea of AI and what that means for archives. I just want to ask you both about how you see these future technologies and possibilities, dangers for archives.
I mean, it's ironic that even though NASA's been the one who's been trying to do all of this, they're the ones who have faced the biggest trouble with obsolescence. I mean, a number of experiments in the 70s is they left records behind which are completely rendered obsolete and illegible today. With regard to DNA, I mean, we're already moving into an era where neural lacing and all of these things are right at our doorstep, and we're going to have artificially generated systems inbuilt into our very brains and nervous systems, only to say that it on the one hand evokes fear and a lot of dread that are we going to lose all sense of humanity, or on the other hand extend the idea or expand the notion of humanity. I mean, the internet is almost like a vast nervous system of information that we're all collectively sharing via some search engines, but sure. So I think for archiving and cutting edge developments, being someone from archives, the most exciting part is really, I don't think we're going into the DNA encryption at Asia Archive, but what we are looking at is how to tap into the vast nervous system of information that we inhabit. And so what kind of collaborations, what kind of information sharing interfaces we would have with other archives, both personal as well as large institutions like Getty or National Archives. So I think the digital and especially current technologies bring up a whole lot of metaphorical possibilities even, and some of them are being realized physically. I think exploring those metaphorical possibilities of can archives be a decentralized brain or one kind of a brain which people can access through their phones or something, through one interface or things like that. So yeah, that's how I guess I would answer that.
I think all I can say is whatever it is we're doing now, we're going to have to do it all over again when the next technology comes along. And I mean, my experience of my whole life has been preserving things, and then by about the time we're done, whatever we were preserving them onto is obsolete, and you have to start over. And so I think the technology that comes carries with it so much physical labor. Maybe that's what we'll be doing for the machines as they keep our archives for us. But I think, it does lead to these other questions that at a certain point, the amount of data becomes so much more than a single researcher can deal with, and more than we can sort of tackle in ways that the humanities have traditionally gone forward. So I think these other ideas moving forward also mean that what I'm seeing a lot more of now is a lot more collaborative research, and then a lot more collaborative research that's also using digital tools to perform analyses. So at the Getty, we're taking provenance records from the 18th century, and after years of meticulously sort of inputting individual sales that were marked in gallery ledger books and things like that, we can now do data visualizations of how was the weather affecting the art market in 1874. How did a historical event maybe change people's mood and therefore affect the market? So, when things transition to the digital, there are certain things that you lose, but then there are whole other ways of investigating that become open that never were before.
Thank you very much. We can open it now for your questions about archives. We have a question here in the front row.
I am very curious about the Getty, the video art, for example. That is what worries me as lover of video art. Are you taking extra measures for preserving better, because it's different in relation to the other disciplines of art? I think the video art is more intangible than others, right? What is the protection that you are already taking for that special media? Because I know that you are a curator of art video a lot, right?
We have our own audiovisual preservation facility, so it's part of our infrastructure that we can digitize things that we have. So we have on site all of the machinery that we need, both to digitize materials, but also to clean them. We often, let's say if we're looking at very early video, like a half-inch open reel Portapack, those analog machines, they're not all identical like today. If one of them is turning slightly faster, slightly slower, you get a worse picture. So we have 5 machines that we might cycle through until we get the best picture possible. And then our goal is to capture the best transfer that we can capture, but we don't do cosmetic surgery, meaning we keep it to the condition of the piece that we have. Whereas I know artists who are trying to make another type of restoration of their work where they might splice together from 2 different submasters so that any little glitch or something is not there. We don't go in at that level. We don't go into the level of the frame to clean things up. We get the cleanest copy that we can. And then, of course, you have to remember, unless you're dealing with a master or submaster, that might not be a very clean copy. And our conservator likens it to trying to spray Windex onto a photograph of a dirty window. If what you had to begin with is a bad copy, then you can't get beyond, the copy that it was made from. So we simply try to get the most stable signal that we can, and then to preserve that digital file. And we have several redundancies. So while we've mostly switched to digital, we still continue to make an analog preservation master. Just because with those tapes, we know exactly how long it takes them to physically decay. And so we're still, while we can still get that tape stock, we're still using it, even though in our daily practice, we've really switched to digital.
Do we have more questions? Got a question in the last row. First on the 3rd row and then the last row. Yeah.
Hi, I'm thinking about how preservation and archiving is actually a privilege. For example, I'm an art student, and if I made big sculptures in analog photography, I'd have to find an extra job to actually store that stuff. I'm working solely digitally because it's free to store it. So yeah, that's just a thought.
Is building an archive a privilege, or is making analog photography the privilege?
No, I think paying for archiving, archiving costs. I mean, the Getty, yes. That's a big institution. You have money. So do I, as an artist, need an institution to pay for my archiving?
We don't collect sculptures, so that's still on the artist to figure out. But what you're saying is actually very reminiscent to what a lot of artists began to say in the 1970s when they began making performance art instead of doing painting. That they were young, they were so burdened by these canvases that they were making that they were having to carry around from place to place and from move to move. And it was just impossible when at that stage in their career, no one was interested in the work and they were making no money, whereas performance really just came from their body, which they have with them at all times. And it pushed into that new medium. And so I think that, I think as an artist, you work with what's going to be most sustainable and available. I don't know that there's any mandate that you have to make large sculpture.
this goes against everything that I do at AA probably, but I'm going to say it anyways because it is what I feel. I don't think it's the responsibility of artists to build their standardized archives. That's what we archivists do. Artists should do and collect the things that they collect and do what they do in the production of a work in whatever way they want, whether it's analog, digital, in whatever medium, whatever format, whatever classifications. And then when archivists step in, they find this magical world of all kinds of experimental classifications, experimental categories, all sorts of random and useful material, and that brings the charm of actually revisiting that archive. So an increasing professionalization of the field almost imposes upon the artist that, you have to preserve this documentation, that documentation in this way. I mean, sure, it helps people like us if you do, but if you don't, we got to do what we do in any case, and you got to do what you got to do.
Completely agree. If you have an institution who starts telling you how you're going to run your studio and how you're going to be saving things and doing things, and that's affecting your methodology. In a way, I would say it's contaminating your methodology.
That's bad news.
Yet at the same time, I suppose Jonas Makers is right. There is a good reason to have digital paranoia and to kind of have multiple backups.
Well, yeah, I mean, keeping backups is just good practice.
Got a question here.
I have a question to Sabih about preservation through dissemination. Like, how is that made? Because it goes against the copyright, it goes against... and how is it disseminated too? Because I think it's a brilliant idea, although how? That's the...
Well, I mean, as much as copyright laws and copyright policies seem extremely daunting and are monolithic, at the end of the day, at the archive, we have to figure our way around how to receive copyright permissions, and with the increasing developments in Creative Commons and these kind of things, and especially when you go to artists' archives, they're usually the copyright holders of at least the things that they have produced, the documentation that they have produced. So if we are able to convince and discuss with them that if they make it shareable under whatever certain conditions that they feel comfortable with, then AA keeping a digital copy and uploading it on its servers, a Getty keeping maybe the same copy that we digitize with the artist's permission, also keeping a copy, and you in your personal hard disk possibly also having a copy, allows that if there is a meltdown in any one place, there are other places where this material is circulating and preserved. Of course, it cannot possibly preserve the kind of metadata that AAA has, or the kind of metadata that Getty or any other institution will be producing around that collection. But there is still something saved, and it's because of the dissemination that digital allows, multiplication and dissemination.
Take maybe one more question. There's a question here. There's a last question here. One here and one here. Let's take them both. One in the third row, fourth row, and one in the second row here. Right in the middle. These are the two last questions. Here.
Hi. My question actually was related to the last one from this gentleman. And my question is about value systems. I'm really interested in Hito Steyer's idea of changing the value system of particularly around images. And in relation to dissemination, perhaps we should be valuing images not on quality, but on speed or velocity of dissemination. And I just wondered what your feeling was on that.
I mean, in defense of the poor image is brilliant. Yeah, I mean, I'm with you on that. There is a stationary aspect to archives, and there's also this high mobility, high acceleration aspect to information, and I think these two are meeting increasingly now. I mean, to answer your question technically, if you preserve files or images on, say, JPEG format, that is a format which will undergo loss every time it's transferred onto different systems. Whereas if you have it on RAW or TIFF format, that's a no-loss format usually. And when you have that, there is something preserved or something not lost in terms of image quality. At the end of the day, it's always great to have a good quality image. I mean, we're all seeking a good quality image. If we can't find it, that doesn't mean that photograph should not go to the archive because it doesn't meet the image quality standards. We often face this problem when we digitize projects, or if, for instance, a digital copy was found in someone's collection, not a hard copy, and it was digitized in low res, we have a minimum requirement of what kind of resolution it should enter the archive. If it doesn't meet it, but that's the only digital record available of it, we'll take it.
I think value systems do change naturally, and it's good for them to change. And, you know, in the Archives of Experiments in Art and Technology, which was a New York-based group exploring technological innovation in the arts, one whole big section of that archive was just instruction manuals for diverse machinery. And I remember the story that many archivists at the Getty, or maybe one, felt, okay, do we really want this? It takes up a lot of space. It's kind of trash. But then, lo and behold, we needed to create a video preservation facility. And you can find all of these old machines out there, but you can never find their manuals. And a lot of those manuals actually do kind of give you, the information you need to repair the machine. And so something that was viewed as worthless became incredibly useful for a completely unanticipated activity. And so the value invested in a medium or a record, you never know how it's going to change and when the importance is going to shift.
We'll take the last question here in the second row in the middle, please.
Thank you very much. I would like to share, there was a very interesting conference at the Ludwig Museum in Budapest just a few months ago about media art conservation. And there were, for example, ZKM, Karlsruhe, such big museums presenting there. And one of the things that I learned there, that there is also new types of master programs now are being offered for archivist studies that are really specifically dealing with media art archiving or archiving issues from digital to analog, analog to digital. So I would like to ask you, since you mentioned you're an archivist, what is the kind of state of education in this field?
It's a very good question, because at various art organizations I know that are either building their own archives or entirely dedicated to archiving, usually they don't get people from library sciences or people who studied archiving technically per se. I mean, there would be some staff like that, but the larger amount of staff developing projects are researchers, art historians, practicing artists, because they're the ones who are kind of interested in this. And also a lot of librarians and like the technical side of archiving, those kind of course people, they have a very tough time sometimes, like just working out the classifications and the content, because so much of the art archiving bit is blurry and messy. I mean, not that other things aren't, but we end up having much more of art historians, art critics, young students who've just completed their graduation coming in. I think if anyone's developing programs where there is this kind of a training in media arts and all of this, especially catered towards cultural fields, it's a very welcome change and recognition of what's going on.
Yeah, our curators are all art historians. Many of our catalogers are also art historians, but then many of them also have degrees in library science or have gone through specific archiving programs. When it comes to media art preservation, there are many different types of programs, and the kinds that I recommend are programs that are very hands-on in learning, and particularly when it comes to analog to digital preservation. The only way to learn how to do that is you have to sit with a guy, and it's almost always a guy. I think it's always a guy who's been doing it for 40 years, who knows how to take the machines apart and put them back together and can teach that one-on-one. I don't actually know of any programs that do that. I think it's basically sort of apprenticeships that do that. And I know our conservator, when he was first starting, he was just kind of traveling around, meeting with people who knew these machines until he'd learned it on his own. And so, he takes kind of apprentices who are working in local programs. But because other programs are more theoretical, and you can theorize media preservation all you want, but we need people who can actually do it. And so that's a different, sort of a different section of the field.
Absolutely agree. Yeah, I mean, I myself, despite having done various research and archival projects, come from an art history and culture studies background, and a lot of my colleagues, and I mean, how we'd get initiated into this is by visiting various libraries and archives and seeing how they do it. And some of them offer these little workshops and training programs to actually tell you how the technical aspects of these are meant to be carried out. And I think if more and more people are emerging in the field like that, it's a nice change.
Great, I think that could not be a better conclusion. I think we already have an idea probably for a next panel, on archives, because when Glenn was mentioning, the Yvonne Reiner archive and this idea that there can, of course, in archive presentations also be reenactments and, live performances. I think one of the things which is very relevant is that the more we have, and I think that makes that clear, that example, the more we have digitization, the more we will actually have access all over the world for scholars, curators, artists, all kinds of practitioners to archives through documentation. But the question will be the question of the embodiment, no? So question of experience. And it's something Tino Segal always points out to me when we speak, that we shouldn't forget. Walter Benjamin talks, of course, of the presencia, and we should never forget the presence. And I think there is a great potential in the future for this embodiment of archives through exhibitions. Thinking, for example, about what Herzog de Meuron did, working with Tino Segal and others, using a dance, a choreography of librarian trolleys in a space where all of a sudden there was a very embodied experience. So maybe that can be the topic for our next panel. Thank you both so much, and thank you all for being here.